Hello everyone, it looks like we're live. So welcome to my talk. Uh, this is about the kitchen of the future. Let's see, can I see you in chat? Yes. So this is a test basically of the of how YouTube is as a platform for giving talks at a virtual convention. This is also a talk I've given quite a few times in the past, so I'm hoping it'll be well polished. It's a bit weird to give a talk without an audience, to be honest, which is why I'm hoping the live chat will help. I'd like to thank Angeline and Jill for organizing this science fiction virtual convention. And if you have a subject you want to talk about, or maybe give a panel or a workshop or something about, there's a housekeeping post that'll link you to all the options. Comment there about the thing you feel you could contribute, you could do, and that'll hopefully be incorporated in the future into this talk. What's probably going to come out of this talk, amongst other things, is that I'm going to write an explanation of how to stream a talk. So if you have no idea how to stream a talk but think you can give one, I'm going to write this down. To be honest, this is my first thing I'm streaming too. So, hello, Angeline. Right, maybe I should move the comments to a place where I can see them without turning my head too much. Anyhow, so now that we've talked about that, let's talk about this talk. This talk is about the kitchen of the future, and I'm Boaz. I'm giving the talk. Who the hell am I, and why am I giving this talk? Well, I have a history of giving science fiction talks. This is a practical talk from a convention years and years ago entitled How to Enslave Humanity. I feel that the makeup was spot on. And what I am is, I used to be a biologist. I'm also a food enthusiast, a sci-fi enthusiast, and a few other things. Yay, people are saying hi. Yes, you can only see me in a tiny window at the bottom. That's how it should be. Would you like to see me on a larger window? I feel that the slides are the central thing. Anyhow, so yes, I'm a person who has a history of giving talks on these subjects, and I like cooking. I especially like fairly modernist cooking techniques, which kind of meshes well with the talk, as you'll see. So let's go into the subject. The first thing we should ask ourselves is food. Why do we eat? No. So that wasn't where I was going. I need to remember the order of these slides. Okay, so let's start with the question about sci-fi. Sci-fi is a good predictor of things in general. This is because sci-fi authors do their research. So they have a generally good idea what they're talking about, and then when years later we read, a sci-fi book from the 50s and we're like, this all happened. We're like, how did they predict this? The truth is they did their research. So did they do their research on food? Do they create like a futuristic food experience that seems correct? And for that we need to answer the core question of how does technology change food? Because a lot of what sci-fi shows us is how technology changes society, right? Very few sci-fi stories are about, look, we built this machine. Most of them are about, look, we built this machine and then everything went wrong in this specific way. Or everything went right in this specific way. So let's ask ourselves, food. What happens when they build this machine to our food? So let's talk about why we eat. First and foremost, we eat because otherwise we die. As biological creatures, food, even if it's not good food, pictured here is some oats, which I know some people like, but I just kind of find them gross. Gruel-like or something. But I still occasionally eat them because sometimes you just need the energy to be able to do stuff. And this has been true for many, many foods in history, right? There's evidence of prehistoric humans in the Paleolithic era, for example, eating fermented grass. Why? Because the alternative was starving, and fermented grass gives you just, enough energy to do stuff. So we do eat food for fuel, but we also eat food for pleasure. Going out to dinner at a nice restaurant is entertainment, right? It's not just you show up and, you eat because otherwise you'd starve. You eat and you really enjoy it. You have a very nice time. The chocolate pictured here is an excellent example of how food is pleasurable these days, right? This is a very in most of the world at this point technologically, right? You can just get yourself a packet of biscuits or some cake from the supermarket, and it may not be fancy by today's standards, but it's definitely food that's there for your pleasure, not because you need caloric intake. And that in itself is an amazing thing about the modern world. So, given these ideas of why we eat, let's ask ourselves, where do we find food in sci-fi? The most common place, honestly, is next to the alcohol that's there to contextualize the scene, such as here, two characters in Babylon 5 are talking at a bar and having a bad time. They're sad, they're drinking. Drinks come with food. That's just how it's drawn. So it's kind of in the corner here. But what happens when food takes center stage? So as we have food that's just the bare minimum to survive, we can have food that represents shortage, right? So this here is Neelix from Voyager. This is actually the cookbook pictured here is a real cookbook, the Star Trek cookbook, with a picture of Neelix on the cover, and it is one of the worst cookbooks I have ever tried to use. However, what is this Neelix from Voyager person, alien thing? He is the ship's chef. Why is having a chef a thing that represents shortage? The reason it represents shortage is because in Star Trek, you have these magical replicator things. Well, any science is any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic, and the replicators are definitely indistinguishable from magic. You click a button, and whatever food you want comes out. And why do they need a chef on Voyager if they have these magical food-making machines? Well, the magical food-making machines require significant amounts of energy, and Voyager is a ship that's far, far away from home and making its way home ever so slowly, and does not have the massive energy reserves that a civilization grants it. And so what it ends up doing is foraging for food and taking on a person to actually cook the food it foraged, like 20th century people. Sorry. So they have a ship's chef to show how desperate they are. By contrast, we often find food whose role it is to show how gluttonous and excessive and potentially corrupt a society is. Right? It's a very common trope, not just in science fiction, especially in fantasy, to be honest, that you have the monarchs dining while the peasants starve, and you need like vast, excessive amounts of food. Sci-fi also has its own trope. Well, not just sci-fi, but I think it's used very nicely in sci-fi, which is food to show that something is alien. So here we have example of this is a parody, of course, but here we have a character who is supposedly alien and then is being served his traditional alien dish of live blood ticks. Now, in Star Trek, one of the ways this is shown is that this alien race called Klingons eat gach. What's gach? It's live worms. They're described as not even tasting good. You eat them for the feeling of something slithering down your throat. Sorry. And that there is to show how alien the society is. That is the goal of the food in this context. So, let's look at, in science fiction, how we usually show dystopian food. I mean, we're on a fairly dystopian timeline. What does science fiction think is in store for us? So, Soylent Green is a book and a movie. Actually, if you want to avoid spoilers for Soylent Green, disconnect and reconnect in like 20 seconds. Also, don't watch any Futurama episodes. So, Soylent Green is about a world where in order to survive, because everything has just become full of people, the only thing to do is eat people. It definitely gets the message of dystopia across, right? Everything's so bad, you have to eat people. Realistically, a person is about 40,000 calories. That'll get you through a month. It takes 9 months to make a new person. Even by that simple math, it's impossible to survive on eating people. The population should decline fairly rapidly. However, the movie is still kind of cheesy and fun. A slightly more realistic dystopian look is Firefly, which has this subplot about these food bars. And these food bars aren't supposed to... have you ever enjoyed a mushy bar of something as, when that was the only food source available? Clearly not. This feels dystopian. So what Firefly did was bring us this food bar that is supposed to be able to feed a family for a month. Also, side note, nothing in this world has enough chemical energy in like that form factor to just like pure chemical energy calculations to be able to generate enough energy to feed a family for a month. So the obvious conclusion is that these are nuclear powered, probably by fusion, because it's the future and fusion is futuristic. My favorite example is Caves of Steel. I was 16 once and Caves of Steel was an amazing book and I didn't know what a terrible person Asimov was at the time. And I mean, the book influenced me. And so we're going to talk about it. In Caves of Steel, part of the robot series, what happens is the humans, there's too many humans to reasonably feed with agriculture. I think the number they've chosen is, the number he's chosen is 10 billion, which is a number we're going to hit very soon anyway. So we're going to see how accurate or inaccurate his predictions are. But they can't reasonably feed everyone off traditional agriculture. So what they instead do is genetically modify yeast to grow in big vats and produce simulations of food we used to have. You have simulated chicken and simulated vegetables and simulated cookies and simulated bread. All that made out of yeast. And that's Asimov's way of showing that the world is so much of a dystopia, you can't even grow food anymore, right? So if you look at the enjoyable food to food for sustenance scale, what Asimov does is basically shift everything to being food for sustenance, right? Food is no longer enjoyable. In fact, a very minor plot point in the book is that one of the main characters becomes important enough to be able to have an allotment of like chicken once a month. So once a month he may enjoy food. And I feel that this is like much more reasonably dystopian in that food, like as we need to feed more people with less resources, we're gonna have to grow less interesting food, right? Chocolate and coffee are great, but they take up significant amounts of space that could grow more food. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, how does sci-fi describe tasty food? And what sci-fi actually does is stick to food we can imagine very often for tasty food. So this here is Chief Garibaldi from Babylon 5 having banya cauda. Banya cauda is this dish. Comments. Sorry, comments are distracting. And anyhow, what we have here is banya cauda. Banya cauda is a dish that we have today. And it's this thing that Garibaldi smuggles the ingredients onto the station against the law, against his doctor's orders, against a bunch of things, just so that he can have his traditional birthday meal. And banya cauda is great because it's had the same recipe for about 1,000 years. It's only 4 ingredients. It is butter, garlic, olive oil, and anchovies. So you heat them all up together and you get nice dipping liquid with like nice cooked garlic flavor and anchovy flavor. And now these days we make it with a food processor, but as someone who made it definitely for research and not because his food processor broke down with the mortar and pestle, it's not that much work. It's way easier than, say, pesto. So this is like well within both time requirements and ingredient requirements of a peasant 1,000 years ago. But obviously not everyday ingredients. Anchovies were still somewhat prized. Garlic was an ingredient for a nice day. And, everyone has butter and olive oil, but you have lots of butter and olive oil. So this is, a special day meal, but for a peasant, not a special day meal for a baron. A baron has, a baron can afford to eat chicken. A peasant, however, a baron can afford to eat chicken maybe once a month. But a peasant can afford to eat banya cauda when it's nice out. In case you're wondering how you eat this, you take some bread and you dip it in it. Also, for those worrying about me coughing, I'm fine. I always cough. This is just how I am. So banya cauda, as long as anchovies exist, I feel will exist in the world. Right? This is a dish that's just has been good, will be good, and is with us forever. And this is a thing that sci-fi kind of does when it wants to present good food to us. It uses something we'd recognize. It doesn't, right? It's easy to say, look at this weird alien thing, we promise you it tastes good, but it's not very convincing. Instead, what it does is show us a dish we can imagine, right? We can all imagine what anchovies and butter taste like. Some of us may not like it, but we can all imagine it. So now that we have this idea of how science fiction generally uses food in order to get other things to us, the audience, we have to ask the question, how does technology affect food? Because if we want to ask how does science fiction change food, we have to, first look at, sure, we have technological advancements and they affect food, but how does this all work? It's because it's not as straightforward as you think. So the main thing technology does is it makes food more accessible. Cakes are mesmerizing, and this machine is a cake making machine. So once upon a time, there were no cakes. And then one day, cake was invented because humans figured out how to make flour and honey in an oven and bake it all together. And we had sweets. And fairly soon after, we had the agricultural revolution, and we had rich and poor people. And then the sweets were the thing that the rich people had, and the poor people did not have the sweets. And as time went on, we got nicer and nicer sweets, but they weren't that accessible. Honey was a special thing. It took a while for humans to figure out how to grow bees, right? Bees were domesticated fairly late. And so Nowadays, we just have cakes. Cakes just exist everywhere, which to me is amazing. So this is what we get from technology. Accessible food, right? It takes things that definitely already existed. If you want something like Queen Victoria's wedding cake these days, it is super simple to make. It was super expensive back then because white sugar was rare. But nowadays, what technology made white sugar available, so anyone can eat basically the same wedding cake that Queen Victoria had. Now, if we look at the original food technology, which is fire, the main thing it did was actually make food either last longer or make it available, right? Lots of cuts of meat are just impossible to eat with human teeth. And so fire softens them. Lots of food would go bad because, two people can't eat the entire gazelle they've hunted. But if you smoke it, then it'll last for a long time. So it made food both longer lasting and accessible. Pots also. Right, you can stick your stuff in a pot and cook it over time, and suddenly your food lasts much longer. It does a few other things. For example, an interesting fact is that we occasionally, when you dig up skeletons, you occasionally find that some of them have lost all their teeth. Dental hygiene was not great, 10,000 years ago. And one thing pots have caused is that the age at which we find toothless skeletons is much longer. We've discovered how to cook grains so that now you can have something to eat even if you don't have teeth. So pots have definitely been like a food-changing experience for a significant amount of mankind for a very long time. Let's look at slightly more modern inventions and how they've changed our food. So what we have here on the upper left corner is chocolate. The invention that made chocolate available to us is surprisingly motors, electric motors. Right, chocolate. Cocoa has been around for a long time. Right, the Aztecs and many South American cultures have eaten cocoa-based things for thousands of years. But chocolate, you need to process it in order to get like that smooth melts in your mouth texture. If you've ever bought like high-end boutique fancy chocolate, taken a bite, and it tasted like there's sand in it or it's like grainy or something, that's because it wasn't motor processed. Because even today, the machine that does this correctly is actually fairly complex and expensive, but available. So we have chocolate. Beer. Beer has been with us for a very, very long time, but historically beer fell into three categories. One, sour. So this is the oldest. Right? If you make beer and don't sterilize anything, you just get like a sour beer. It's still safer to drink than the water, but it doesn't taste very great. Two, a very high alcohol beer, so somewhat like wine. If you get the alcohol level high enough, it preserves better. Again, this is fairly hard to do. But historically it's been done because it preserves the beer. And finally, very hoppy beer. So we've seen a resurgence of IPAs. These are these super hoppy beers. In fact, if you think about it, these three beers that we're seeing a resurgence of are people making beers without heavy use of technology. What's all this technology? Well, microbiology, refrigeration, sterilization, all these things you need. Right, you get yourself a pure culture. If you're trying to make a lager-style beer, it has to be refrigerated. Lagers existed for a very long time, but only in Bavaria and specific caves. Now anyone can make them with proper refrigeration. Next is canned goods, such as Spam. Right, meat that doesn't go bad for years. May not be the tastiest meat, but it is meat that doesn't go bad for years. That is amazing. It should be appreciated. And finally, unsalted butter. You're wondering, we've had butter forever, but historically butter was unpasteurized, and unpasteurized butter goes very rancid very fast. So what you need to do is add about 10% salt to it. Let's see what the comments say. Buzz, don't give me online corona. I thank you, people. Salted butter was in the past very salty. 10% salt is so high, it's actually fairly unusable for cooking. Lots of very old cookbooks describe ways to remove salt from butter so that you can use it. High-end restaurants used to get their butter fresh every day so that they could serve their customers regularly salted butter and not super salted butter. This was fairly fancy. And now you can just walk into any store and buy your pasteurized, refrigerated, unsalted butter and just have it. And that is amazing. So, does tech change food in sci-fi? Again, we're back to the robot series, but I really like this example because what it says here is there are Solarian delicacies, pachinkas. I had to reprogram my chef so he could make them properly. In the first place, you need to have imported Solarian grain. So what's described here is there's food, and they had to import the grain. Well, where did they have to import it from? A planet far, far away. They have developed not just, faster than light technology, a thing impossible by today's physics. They use it so that their food can taste just right, which I find is perfect because this is what's going to happen in real life, right? We develop, precision thermometers and end up using them in cooking appliances. We develop lasers and end up using them to play with cats. This is what humans do. So I find this description a very good one about what how technology affects food, right? Something you wouldn't think of. A faster than light thing makes people want the exact right grains. Sorry, I need some water. I'll be back in 10 seconds. You should write this down as a tip to people giving talks. Have a cup of water in front of you. So, an even more interesting one is Star Trek and the replicators. So we've already talked about the replicators, right? They allow you to have instantly any food you want. How would that affect food? You would think what would happen was, well, no one cooks anymore. You just go to the machine and it makes the exact thing you want. That's not what happens in Star Trek. In Star Trek, Deep Space Nine specifically, the captain's dad is a chef. He owns a restaurant called Cisco's Creole Kitchen. In that, he buys real unreplicated ingredient and cooks them. Now remember, Star Trek is socialist utopia. There is no money. So he's also doing this for free. This person runs a restaurant, a high-stress business, making something that any machine could make instantly for free. Who would value this? Is this a reasonable way we'd expect technology to change food? So I think the answer is yes. Also, note the comfort food is a thing we'd recognize trope, right? Creole food, you can get that now. It's not, something fancy and futuristic. His kitchen is even very recognizable. But back to our topic, I feel that it is very reasonable that in a future where you can have any food you want instantly, what's valued is handmade food. And we see this throughout history. What's valued is scarcity. Here are 4 foods that used to be very scarce. So on the top left, we have meringue. We still have meringue, right? It's not considered fancy anymore, but you needed a motor in order to make it. And before the motor, the way you'd make it is by hand. You have to remember that even a balloon whisk is a fairly new invention. Old whisks were basically bundles of sticks tied together. This used to be like a 3-hour thing. A person used to literally have to stand 3 hours and whip egg whites every time he wanted a meringue. So serving a meringue at dinner would say, I can waste 3 hours of a person's time for my enjoyment. Another one is pesto. Pesto, once again, made easy by the motor. Before we had food processors, you'd have to have someone standing there with a mortar and pestle, grinding pesto all night for the restaurant. And we have here pate, liver pate. Once again, grinding liver, an icky job, and had to be done by hand and was a lot of work. And especially, right, chopped liver always existed and was always a commoner's food, but pate, that was high end. Why? Because getting the liver smooth enough, that was significant work. Nowadays, anyone can just blitz it in their food processor. And finally, we get to the quenelle. This is fish meat usually that's been ground very finely and then poached. So it's like the inside of a very cheap fish finger or a fish stick. And so you have this very cheap fish stick filling thing. And it used to be very fancy because what you had to do was basically take fish meat and push it through a very fine sieve until it became smooth. And the interesting story is that the inventor of the food processor and founder of the Magimix company really liked these. He liked them so much, he invented an entire machine to make them, the Magimix. And along the way, they also made pate and pesto available to us on a much larger scale. The quenelles, however, what happened was lots of restaurants started serving them, and everyone realized they're actually kind of disgusting. So they actually kind of disappeared from the culinary landscape, and the person may have made his favorite dish go extinct accidentally by making it easy to make. So the dish was never valued for its flavor. It was only valued for its scarcity, and the moment that went away, the dish disappeared. So we live in a post-motorized world, and what does that make for our food? What does that do to our food? How does it affect the food we generally see in restaurants these days? So anything you can do with the motor isn't interesting. Nowadays, it's all about having whole chunks of things. Whole chunks means you have to work with precision because you can't just check inside. It means you have to have much better cooking techniques. So once again, about scarcity, about having someone who's highly trained make your food. It's also about fairly scarce ingredients. I believe this is like quail confit and mashed potatoes. Here we have gnocchi with whole pieces of basil, right? And Parmesan and truffles, and you could easily grind this Parmesan and basil and olive oil that's on it into pesto, but you don't, because that's not valued anymore. Now it's the big whole chunks that are valued. Here we have a steak and even whole cuts of chicory and a whole deep fried asparagus. Here we have whole scallops and a duo of chicken and I believe it's duck. But there was one thing there that stood out as weird. I said mashed potatoes initially, didn't I? Why are the mashed potatoes here? Mashed potatoes are clearly a motorized creation. Well, they are in fact not a motorized creation. What were the mashed potatoes I showed you are from Joël Robuchon, who is often considered to be the greatest chef of the 20th century. He died recently. It was fairly sad. And when he died, you must have seen many people mention mashed potatoes on Facebook all of a sudden, because that is his most famous dish. Why are these mashed potatoes such a famous dish in a world where anyone can just, mechanically mash potatoes? Well, let's talk about his mashed potatoes. The first thing you need is ingredient scarcity. You can't just use any potatoes, you have to use a fairly scarce type of potato called larat. Larat are a very weird type of potato to use in a mashed potato. They're usually used for baking, actually, and they're hard to grow. They only grow in certain climates. They have a very low yield, and they have a very intense flavor. So you have both ingredient scarcity and a very good tasting thing. But don't get me wrong, if these potatoes were common, we wouldn't be using them. We would use something more scarce. We'd be enjoying them instead in our everyday mashed potatoes. Next, you must not motorize. There are two reasons not to motorize. So what you see here on the left and right is either a mechanical food mill, which even in high-end restaurants, you operate these by hands. Electric food mills will not do. But many chefs will tell you, for this sort of mashed potato, even a food mill is wrong. On the right, you have a potato ricer, basically a press which pushes the potatoes through holes. And in the center, you have your Magimix, which you're not allowed to use. Why? One, because that would ruin the scarcity. But two, because potatoes have starch in them. And that starch comes in granules. When you cook the potato, these granules stay together. Anyone who's ever thickened a stock or a sauce with cornstarch knows that it kind of reduces the flavor. And same thing happens when you blend potatoes. You're breaking up the starch and mixing it in, so you're getting a reduced flavor. So to keep your flavor at maximum, you make sure you're not breaking up the starch, and you use a potato mashing method that fits that. So you've mashed your potatoes, then you add butter, lots of butter, a ridiculous amount of butter. 1/3 of the mashed potatoes is butter by weight, right? So you mash 200 grams of potatoes, and then you add 100 grams of butter, right? You mash a pound of potatoes, add half a pound of butter. Then after you've mixed those in, you also add some milk and some creme fraiche, and then you run it through a very fine sieve, such as the ones in the picture. And since this is a very thick mashed potato, you can't just, pour it through. You have to get this piece of plastic and push it through aggressively and scrape it off the sides. It's a bunch of work. But surely these are fancy mashed potatoes. You can afford a bunch of work, and you've made them. You then serve them, or you're probably thinking, okay, I do this once a week. I have a big batch of mashed potatoes. But no, these mashed potatoes, because of the vast amount of butter, are actually not stable. They'll fall apart and turn into this puddle of butter and potato within about 4 hours of their making. So you can't even, make the daily batch in the morning. If you're serving these for dinner, you have to after your lunch service is done, you have to make fresh mashed potatoes for dinner, separate from the lunch service. So Cisco's Creole Kitchen actually makes perfect sense. Why? Because in a world where anyone can have instant food, what's appreciated is the scarcity. And everyone wants to be appreciated, right? Maybe he doesn't get money, but he definitely gets recognition as the person who makes the thing everyone covets. So, what does history teach us here? It teaches us that scarcity is important for fine foods, right? Lots of food tastes good. I love fried chicken. Fried chicken is amazing, but fried chicken is not a fine food. Whereas Kobe beef is a fine food, not just because it's delicious, but because it's rare. It's hard to find. So tech changes what can be done, but it also changes what's easy to do. And this has the conclusion of once we can make a food, but it's hard, becomes gourmet. But then when anyone can make it, it goes from gourmet to becoming common. And then it has two routes. Either it's good enough that it remains with us, like pesto. Pesto has definitely not gone away, quite the opposite. Why? Because pesto is delicious. Or it goes extinct, like the quenelle. So, what do researchers say the future has in store? So, A significant amount of what they talk about, if you read some futurology, is about the molecular cooking movement, which is interesting because it doesn't exactly exist. There's actually two different movements, and let's talk about them. So there's modernist cuisine and modernist culinary, which is a movement mostly focused on the art of cooking, making food that is the equivalent of modern art. It breaks your expectations. It's surprising to you. On the other side, there's molecular gastronomy, which is an academic field. Like, you have molecular gastronomy professors, journals, conferences, research. And so let's have a slightly deeper look at those. Helvetius is, I think he is the most important face of molecular gastronomy, and he is somewhat, he's a bit of a character. He's become a bit of a small celebrity in France, actually. Has had his own TV show. But at the end of the day, he's first and foremost an academic researcher. And you can search papers he's published, and they're written in this very dry, boring, hard to read language. And this is interesting because a lot of what he researches isn't for professional kitchens. It's for isn't for industrial kitchens. Historically, food science has been the science of industrial food production. But a lot of what he researches is for either professional kitchens or the home rather than industrial things. However, there isn't that much to say about him. So let's talk about the next person, who's far more interesting. Ferran Adrià is, many would say, the first modernist chef. He was a military cook, and he joined a restaurant called El Bulli. Within 18 months, he was the head chef of El Bulli. Remember, with no chef's training, just a military cook. From there, he bought the restaurant and completely changed the menu and replaced what you would expect in a regular restaurant somewhere in Catalonia with his own creations. What do his own creations look like? So in this image, we have a margarita, salted caramel, flavored olive oil, and chocolate. Anyone want to guess which is which? So by the time the live stream catches up with the comments, it's going to be too late. But anyhow, the pink thing is chocolate, the golden thing is caramel, the spirally thing is olive oil, and the foamy thing is a margarita. And this is what his food looks like. It's modern art, only edible. It breaks your expectation of what food is. As such, he's not a good predictor of the future, right? He's just an artist. However, I don't find that's actually true, because to some extent, what becomes popular in food art then becomes popular in what food will look like. So we do kind of expect this, and in fact, mid-range and even low-end restaurants are now serving foam and, bubbles and spheres on your food. So it is a reasonable predictor. Maybe we'll see more of this. This is, by the way, how his restaurant served soup the one year. So the soup dish would show up like this, and then someone would pour hot water on this, and it would all dissolve into a bowl of soup. So far more interesting people for this are the people who combine the two fields. Heston Blumenthal, probably much more popular in this part of the world than where I usually give this talk, and Nathan Myhrvold, who's, I'll talk about him in a moment. Heston Blumenthal does both types of things. Right, he's fairly famous for his chips, which are he just wanted chips that are crunchier on the outside and softer on the inside, and he sat down and engineered them. And this is a complete food science thing to do. He sat down and researched how to do a thing and made them, and they're delicious. They've also transformed the chips we have in many other places. He published his recipe, many people picked up his recipe. We now get better chips than we did 15 years ago, thanks to him. On the other side is a dish that's uniquely his. It's called Sounds of the Ocean. It tastes like the ocean. It is served with headphones that play ocean sounds. It's a piece of art. There's some engineering here, right? You have to get the foam just right. But at the end of the day, what he did here was create artwork. Nathan Myhrvold is much more into the scientific part of this. He has a very interesting life story. He wanted to be a chef, promised his parents he'd at least apply for one PhD program, accidentally got into Stephen Hawking's lab. While he was there, he started a startup with his friends, so when he graduated, he'd have a money source, and that startup got bought by Microsoft, and Bill Gates kept talking him into staying, and years and years later, he was the fourth most important person in Microsoft. And this took him ages to get out of this. I think it was like 20 years of not being a chef, where he just had to, make money and run a major company. And he left this poor, sad billionaire who never got to be a chef. So he left and immediately went and got to be a chef. And he told himself, and being a fairly rich person, he ate at many high-end restaurants, saw the trend. He ate at Ferran Adria's restaurant, at Heston Blumenthal's restaurant, and said, these dishes are cool. Where's the book that teaches me how to make them? And discovered that the book doesn't exist. So he did the reasonable thing and opened the food lab and wrote it. This is the book. It's a very nice book. It weighs 40 pounds. It is ridiculously expensive. It is very, very overproduced and printed in a fairly small number of copies because they didn't expect it to sell. It sells for, I think it sells for only 300 euros now. Originally it sold for 600 euros. And, it succeeded more than he expected. But it actually succeeded more than anyone expected and kind of started this idea that you could cook a lot of this at home. Now, what you have to know about this book is that lots of it isn't even home friendly, right? It contains recipes where you're like, and then put it in your massive centrifuge. Well, where am I going to stick a massive centrifuge in my tiny Dublin apartment? It's not going to happen. Stick it in your lab equipment rotovap thing. None of us have that. And yet, the book had significant impact on many restaurants and some home cook enthusiasts, and many existing cookbooks today take after it. Here's its mashed potatoes recipe, or this is in fact 6 mashed potatoes recipes. The steps aren't even listed on this page because the previous page describes the principles of making mashed potatoes. Once you understand the principles of making mashed potatoes, you simply take the ingredient ratios listed here, apply the recipe, and you will get mashed potatoes. Which, it's very different from your traditional cookbook. Also, it has these gorgeous pictures. Like, these are actual photographs. This one did involve like a sheet of glass that had to be removed in Photoshop. But other than that, it is an honest-to-God cutaway photograph of a grill, which is fairly nice. The cookbook also contains a bunch of other things, like his description of his world's best cheeseburger, which takes 36 hours, and you have to make all the ingredients from scratch, including the cheese. And, the book contains the history of cooking, a review of physics, because you can't cook if you don't understand the heat distribution equation, overview of new and old cooking equipment and ingredients and techniques, introduction of some new processes for food that he adapted from these high-end restaurants that were doing new and creative things, and from new food journals, and finally some recipes from like super complicated, super modernist art piece type dishes to the humble omelet. This is what the omelet looks like. So what? He published a book, and So this book probably influenced the start of the sous vide cooking movement more than anything else. Sure, the book, it would have probably caught on its own, but many experts say that this book is really what pushed this into the mainstream. And what is this sous vide cooking movement? So this is a photo of some fairly old sous vide cooking equipment. And now the idea behind it, so if you look at the steak, the outside is nice and crispy and browned, and the inside is red and soft, but there's this grayish strip of meat that's cooked not to the amount you want it. Now, some people like this. I am among them, right? You get a varied bite, but some people don't. And some people, occasionally want a uniform steak, and it does taste nice. How would you make a uniform steak, though, right? Once you apply heat to the outside and you're trying to brown it, the inside can't heat perfectly evenly because heat distribution takes time. Well, the idea behind sous vide is that you take your meat, seal it in a airtight plastic bag, and submerge it in water at a specific temperature. Why would this do what you want? Because cooking, like doneness of meat, is not a function of time, it's a function of temperature. So if you get all your meat to the exact temperature you want it, it'll be all at the doneness you want it. So if you want your medium rare meat to be all medium rare, you set it to 53 degrees, submerge it for an hour, and your meat is all medium rare. Now, this is kind of overkill for a steak, but short ribs are a more interesting version of this because there's two processes going on in short ribs. One is the cooking of the meat, but the other is the breaking down of collagen because short ribs are a very hard cut of meat, and you need to usually cook them for a long time at a high temperature to soften them. However, collagen breaks down even at 57 degrees. So take your meat, cook it at 57 degrees for 3 days. That's how long it takes to soften these, and you have medium rare short ribs, which is a very surprising result. Sous vide also makes excellent vegetables, and specifically it allows you to cook them to a specific temperature where the vegetables themselves soften but don't lose lots of the flavor you get when you heat them above that. The temperature is 85 degrees, and the reason I'm telling you all this is because all of this has already been happening for 10 years. Odds are you've already eaten food cooked this way, and you probably thought it was delicious. So behind the scenes, this adaptation of a technology actually changed the way we eat, even if we didn't notice it. One more thing it does is eggs. Now, eggs are just eggs. You're like, why bother hard-boil them? But actually, a surprising amount of food you eat is based on eggs. Ice cream, you have to cook eggs to a specific temperature. Custard, you cook eggs to a specific temperature. Poached eggs, obviously. Mayonnaise, right? If you make traditional mayonnaise, you just might get salmonella. No one likes salmonella. So now you can pasteurize your eggs. And so, as I said, making custards, making stocks, pasteurizing, reheating food with no off flavors, because off flavors come from oxidation. So you can cook your food, cool it, heat it, and it'll taste just like you've heated it the first time. Scaling, you can also make a much larger number of meals at the same time with this. And one of the interesting ones is ripening fruit. Very often you get fruit and it's not ripe, and it would be ripe if you just held it at 45 degrees for a few hours. And I know what you're thinking, oh my god, I can have ripe avocados instantly. Sadly, ripening avocados is the one thing it doesn't do. The other thing it doesn't do is brown food. Not as in it can't make anything that is brown, it can't turn food brown. What do I mean by that? It means that here is a sous vide cooked medium rare steak. it's medium rare on the outside too. And honestly, that's pretty weird. So how do we make it, brown on the outside and medium rare on the inside? And generally, what is this browning? So browning is what gives us a lot of flavor in many things. It comes from a set of chemical reactions called the Maillard reactions. Maillard spelled Mallard. French is a lovely language. And it what makes our coffee smell good, fried onions smell good, and even the crust of bread. So delicious. There's also browned chocolate, which is one of my favorite things ever. Once again, brown chocolate is a technology that actually used to be fairly rare. Some company called Valrhona discovered it, patented it. Its patents are now expired, and brown chocolate is becoming more and more common, and I'm very happy about that. So here's your steak that's sous vide plus browned. You'll notice that it's like perfectly brown on the outside, and the moment that browning stops, it's like red on the inside. In order to achieve this, it's fairly simple. All you have to do is take your steak, dunk it in a liquid nitrogen vat for 30 seconds, in hot oil for 30 seconds, and then voila, serve it. Those of you without liquid nitrogen, you can achieve almost as precise a result with a fry pan, but it won't look as ridiculous and over the top. So if you're feeling a bit extra, go get yourself some liquid nitrogen. Actually, don't. Liquid nitrogen is fairly unsafe. As someone who's had to work with it, you need good ventilation. Don't play around with liquid nitrogen unless you know what you're doing. But, and don't stick your hand in it unless you know what you're doing. But sticking your hand in it is fine. So what did the market look like when the modernist cuisine came out? So there's two parts to cooking sous vide, right? You seal your stuff in a bag, and then you cook it sous vide. And sealing food in a bag has actually been around for a fairly long time. This here is a food saver. As the name implies, it's designed to save food. Americans for a very long time would vacuum seal their food for the purpose of saving it in the fridge, not cooking it in the bag, just keeping it fresh. Vacuuming and sealing devices were already on the market at a fairly consumer price point. What about the cooking, right? You need to keep that water bath at a very precise temperature. When the book came out, what existed was this device pictured here, and this device is lab equipment. It's not kitchen equipment. Lab equipment is produced in very low volumes. It's finicky. These things only work on distilled water, so you have to make sure you're filling your water bath with distilled water, not tap water. Very quickly after the book came out, it was replaced. Very quickly after the book came out, it was replaced with much more reasonable devices. And nowadays, if you go on Amazon, you can see that the market is actually fairly flooded with precision cookers, with sous vide devices. So clearly this is catching on. By the way, my personal recommendation, if you're going to buy a sous vide device, buy it from a reputable company. Wenkel down here, or VPCOK or whatever they are not real companies, and I don't know how well their devices work. So do your research. I've definitely, as an experiment, bought a €20 device off someplace, and my God, was it inaccurate. So if you don't mind your meat being cooked to a completely different temperature than you asked, buy a cheap one. Otherwise, I say splurge for an expensive device. So, what else are we seeing in food? We're basically seeing lab stuff invade regular food processes. Enzymes used to be fairly hard to make in large quantities. These, by the way, are enzymatically peeled oranges. So again, one of the fancy things they like to do in high-end restaurant is have peeled citrus slices. Why? Because it's a bunch of work. Sure, it's nice, but honestly, it's not a game changer except for the fact that it's a bunch of work. What's changing is lots of restaurants are now instead taking these orange slices and dunking them in an enzyme bath that peels them, which sounds kind of weird, but you get the same result. This is transglutaminase, or more commonly referred to as meat glue. This was going to change everything. Turns out it didn't, because this kind of freaks people out. But what it basically does is take 2 cuts of meat and attach them like they were the same cut of meat, even if they couldn't be. Say, for example, this tuna and salmon slice here would feel like it was a cut, like a single cut of both tuna and salmon simultaneously. So it's kind of weird, and people never got on board with that, but it exists. High fructose corn syrup is actually a fairly interesting use of enzymes that's common every day. Of course, it's not a great one, right? We're turning basically glucose into significantly more harmful type of sugar, and adding it to food. But it's an enzymatic process that we've all just accepted into our lives. The enzyme here is called isomerase. And enzymes at home seem weird, but we've actually already brought them in. Anyone who's buying bio laundry detergent, and I highly recommend bio laundry detergent because it's much more eco-friendly, is buying complex enzyme sets which clean your clothes. So we already have enzymes in our homes. If you're in Ireland, then your washing machine is probably in your kitchen, and so you already have enzymes in your kitchen, just not enzymes you cook with. So we're almost there. Another thing is genetically modified organisms. What we have here is, when you cut apples and then you leave them out, they kind of turn brown. Here's an apple genetically modified not to turn brown. Of course, we can't have that in Europe. But if you look at potatoes, right? Potatoes are historically, especially here in Ireland, a fairly dystopian food. So we've had potatoes, and occasionally we haven't had potatoes, and the Brits took all the rest of the food away, and it was bad. And the cause of that is the potato blight. These days, we can genetically modify potatoes to be resistant to potato blight. And countries that still depend on potatoes can have this and not have their crops wiped out. This can significantly increase their food safety, right? Especially for poor people. So this is an example of a very positive use of genetically modified food, right? Allowing people to make sure their food doesn't just disappear one day. There's also another thing is milk, right? Milk is actually a fairly not ecological thing to have because of the way we produce it. We need cows, and cows produce a bunch of methane. It isn't great. What if you could instead produce milk from yeast? And there are people working on this, trying to make milk, but without the cow. This will allow us to have a much more sustainable thing. So now we've had a look at these technologies. Let's ask ourselves: we've seen food change in our real world. Was sci-fi right? So if you look at dystopian food, it looks less like Soylent Green and more like golden rice. Golden rice is what's here on the right. What happens is, in lots of the third world, in lots of poor countries, the only thing available to the poor population is rice. And we aren't fixing that. So as a dystopian solution, we are increasing the nutrient value of rice to the point where it can sustain humans, so that in our dystopia, at least people aren't dying of vitamin A shortage or kids going blind of vitamin A shortage. And right, in a utopian world, we'd just be giving them better food, but we're not in a utopian world, so this is our dystopian food thing. Not Soylent Green, but just high nutrient food for the poor. It's fairly sad, honestly. Garibaldi would still have his bagna cauda, possibly with a more advanced professional food blending device. And, you know, Cisco would still have his restaurant. We'd just expect more modern equipment in it, right? Even if you make old traditional recipes, it's weird to use 70s technologies, even today in a restaurant, to cook today's food. It would be weird if 200 years from now you're using today's technology to cook food. So I'd expect Cisco's father's kitchen to actually look very crazy to us, even if the food he's making is recognizable. And finally, Asimov's description of pachinkas, by the way, are just filled pancakes, which filled pancakes are great. I expect them to be around forever. Lots of this talk was inspired by a book called Consider the Fork. I highly recommend it. So if you want to dig deeper into how food changes us humans, here's the book to look at. Now, I'll be taking questions off of the question queue. Sorry about that. The question queue is a bit delayed and a bit stuck. And by question queue, I just mean the live chat. So if anyone has questions, type them in. I'll see them and answer them. Okay, cheese or butter? So cheese or butter? Butter has fairly varied uses, but cheese in itself is fairly varied. I think I like cheese more, but this is a very hard choice. Okay. Since it seems no one's asking questions, bye everyone. It's been nice talking to you. This talk is recorded, so it's now available basically forever. And I hope future con goers will have the chance to watch this talk too. Bye everyone.